In this video, I will talk about a learning theory that usually goes by the name of Andragogy, meaning adult learning. If you look at the etymology of andragogy, it comes from the Greek word andr, meaning adult, and agagos, meaning leader of. This can be contrasted with pedagogy, which is a synthesis between agagos then and pais, which means child. While pedagogy is thus about leading children, andragogy is about leading adults. So from an etymological perspective, it is thus clear that a distinction can be made between andragogy and pedagogy. Andragogy has its basis in the works of Malcolm Knowles. When he was developing his theory in the second half of the 20th century, research on adult learning was somewhat in a disarray. The field was fragmented among a lot of different research fields, and a large part of the research was based on lessons learned in relation to children's learning, not the learning of adults. Knowles believed that this was a problem as adults, according to him, had their own conditions for learning. Starting from children's learning to describe adult learning then became a problem because it meant that it wasn't possible to assess clearly what made adult learning unique. So to overcome this problem, Knowles wanted to gather existing research on adult learning into a unified theory, which he described then as andragogy. Knowles developed andragogy by conducting a comprehensive theoretical analysis looking at various research fields that discussed adult learning from different perspectives. Based on that analysis, he identified these 6 principles that he believed were fundamental to understanding how adults learn. Adult learners need to know concerns that adults have a need to know why they need to learn something. While children do not generally question the design and content of teaching, according to Knowles, adults want to understand why the teaching is necessary for them to reach their goals. If they are able to agree on that the design and the content of the teaching is reasonable, then that will in turn increase their motivation to learn. A teacher should therefore make an effort to explain the rationality behind their teaching so that the students can make an assessment of its value. The second principle, the self-concept of the learner, emphasizes that adults have a need to feel that they are autonomous, that they themselves can take responsibility for their own learning. This principle in andragogy thus places great responsibility on the students themselves to take responsibility for their own learning instead of the teacher taking control of the learning process and forcing the student to adopt a certain way of learning. If the teacher does not succeed in giving the student this responsibility, there is a risk, according to Knowles' reasoning, that they will oppose the teaching and the teacher themselves. The goal of the teacher should therefore be to encourage students to become more autonomous and take responsibility for their own learning. It should be also pointed out that this principle contributes to a large extent to the development of the learning theory of self-directed learning. The prior experience of the learners is a principle that assumes that adults have significant experiences that affect learning. These experiences affect the learning process in that the student has to a greater extent than children, just because that they have a lot more experience based on having lived and experienced more. So adults have to a greater extent than children. They have to reflect on how what they learn relates to their previous experiences. So according to Knowles, the fact that the students have previous experiences can be problematic for their learning process. For example, students may have developed such biases, preconceptions, and mental barriers that prevent them from understanding or absorbing new knowledge or alternative perspectives. A teacher must therefore create opportunities where the students' experiences are giving not only the opportunity to develop, but also the opportunity to be challenged. This can be done, for example, by arranging group discussions, doing simulated exercises, letting them solve problems together, and more. It should be noted here that Knowles relied heavily on David Kolb's theories on experiential learning when developing this principle. Kolb also influenced the development of the principle of orientation to learning, the fifth principle, which I will discuss shortly. Then we have the principle of readiness to learn, which means that adults become ready to learn something when they need to learn something. According to Knowles, a child is more ready to learn something because the teacher says that they need to learn it. An adult, on the other hand, wants to learn something when they consciously or unconsciously perceive a need for a new knowledge or a new skill. Here we can imagine a couple who are about to become parents and who therefore feel the need right now to learn more about childbearing and caring, which they had no interest in previously. Or we can imagine a person who discovers that they lack a certain skill that they need to do their work effectively, and who therefore begins to learn more about that in order to be able to meet the deficiency that they discovered in their ability to do their work. Within a program at a university, for example, a progression should therefore be developed that takes into account the varying needs that the students will encounter during the course of their learning. If these can be predicted, you can thus design the teaching so that these needs are met in the teaching while they are happening. Then we move on to orientation to learning, which is based on the premise that adults want to see that the knowledge or skills that they learn are actually rooted in genuine problems or tasks that they might encounter in their everyday life. Students thus want to understand how what they are expected to learn connects to current or future lived situations. Therefore, according to Knowles, adults will respond better to such learning methods where they are expected to solve concrete problems or when the knowledge they are presented is put in relation to genuine real-world contexts. Finally, we have the principle of motivation to learn, which emphasizes that adults are motivated more by internal than external motivators. External motivators are those that come from external demands, needs, or reward systems. For example, it could be about getting a promotion or a higher salary, or for a student, it could be just about getting a degree. And that's the highly motivating factor for learning more. These can motivate the adult to learn. But Knowles points out that if you want to create the conditions for long-term commitment, educators should rather focus on internal motivators. According to him, an adult will be more motivated to learn if you start from the individual's subjective needs, interests, and values. Instead of motivating through external demands and rewards, the teacher thus seeks to motivate the students by speaking to their inner desire to develop, to learn new things, or to achieve personal goals. If the focus can be put on such internal motivators, the adult can thus experience the learning as more meaningful, and thus that person, also the student, becomes more motivated. So if you reflect on this list, I think several of you would argue that it is reasonable to some extent. As adults, we are, for example, generally more prepared to take responsibility for and control over our own learning. We also want to feel that what we learn is useful and can have meaning to our lives, or give meaning to our lives in some sense. However, although the theory seems reasonable, there are those who have criticized andragogy for not being able to capture the multifaceted nature of learning. A problem with the theory of andragogy is that adults do not seem to learn in the way that Knowles describes adult learning in all situations and for all people. Adults are not a homogeneous group that functions in the same way always. Therefore, it is not surprising that different adults will respond in different ways when they encounter the learning through these 6 principles. For example, not all students are interested in being self-directed in their learning. Instead, they prefer to receive clear instructions for how they should learn something. In addition, the principles developed by Knowles also seem to have an impact on developing children's and young people's learning. This makes it difficult to argue that these principles summarizes something that is unique to specifically adult learning, which was one of Knowles' purposes when developing this theory. Another basis for criticism is that the theory puts too much focus on individual learning. As these critics might argue, there is a risk that Knowles' emphasis on self-directed learning idealizes an Americanized view of learning, you could call it, in which the individual student heroically assumes responsibility for their own learning. As these critics instead emphasize, learning always takes place in a social context, something that Knowles' theoretical approaches do not seem to take into account. Another problem with andragogy is that the transformative potential of learning, as well as the critical need towards social change, is forgotten in this understanding of learning. Thus, andragogy, as Knowles describes it, has no purpose or goal in education beyond understanding the learning of the adult individual, which will be criticized by those who argued that education should lead to meaningful changes of various kinds in society or in the personal lives of the students. The conclusion that thus can be drawn is that Knowles did not succeed in formulating a theory that could gather all research and knowledge about adult learning into a unified theory. While some claimed that it has been useful for designing adult education, it could not be the basis for describing how adults learn in all contexts and could not describe how all adults learn. Due to this criticism, it is difficult to claim that andragogy is a theory in the strictest sense, in the sense that it offers a theory on how adults actually learn. Rather than, as some have suggested, andragogy should be rather understood as a set of guidelines perhaps, or a philosophy, or a collection of assumptions, or as the descriptions of a process. As mentioned, Knowles wanted it to be understood as a theory in the sense that it wants to give a general descriptions of how adults learn. This is also claimed to be a reason why Knowles has been met with so much criticism, as he could not deliver on this initial promise after being subject to critical scrutiny. For that reason, even Knowles had to back away from his initial assumptions and ambitions. He landed on that andragogy should rather be understood as a collection of principles that can be applied to understand some adult learning situations, although not all. Regardless of this criticism, it is widely acknowledged that Knowles managed to rally scholars around a concept that formed a unifying idea and identity. When he started, there was no coherent research that looked at adult learning. Knowles thus laid the foundation for an entire field of research that looked at adult learning by gathering it around a single concept, andragogy. Still today, there are several, though not all, but there are several scholars who still use the term andragogy to describe the academic discipline that focuses then on adult learning. So this was a brief description of andragogy. I hope it gave you a greater understanding of this theory, if we can call it that at all. Thank you for listening.